Hello and welcome to another episode of Unsubscribe, the Demand Drive podcast. I am your host, AJ Alonso, and today we've got 4 people on the podcast. It's not a new record, but it's been a long time since we've had this many people jump on. We're going to be asking 5 questions to Jason Tissera. He's the co-founder over at Upmarket, and Tommy Jenkins. She's the product owner for NLP, natural language processing for all you folks out there. But before we jump into the conversation, I got to turn it over to Alex first, my co-host. Alex, how you doing?
I'm good. Is it the same question every time, AJ? Just how you doing? Do you never ask why I'm doing or what I'm doing?
I know what you're doing, thankfully, but why are you doing it? That's the real question here.
Because I care.
I like it. I love it. So like I said, we've got Jason and Tommy on with us today. We're going to be talking about broadly moving past some binary outcomes for SDRs, and more specifically, how we can set up some feedback loops to help make use of those. So before we jump into the meat of the conversation, Jason and Tommy, I'd love for you to introduce yourselves, give the audience an idea of who you are, what you do, and what Upmarket's all about. So Jason, you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Thanks, AJ. My name is Jason Tissera. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Upmarket. Founded it with my colleague, Tiffany Marquin. Tiff and I are both engineers, but I got my start in enterprise technology at SAP, where I was first a consultant and then moved on to solution engineering. Kind of got a full understanding of how enterprise tech is sold, which was a great start for me because right after SAP, I jumped into startups here in New York. I worked as a full cycle sales person, finding deals, closing them, and after that, we started building software companies. So this is my second company that I built, and Upmarket is a sales enablement platform. It enables inside sales reps with powerful playbooks that enable them to close deals quickly, set meetings, and we've been starting to build out some really cool products that are fit into Zoom and Microsoft Teams that deploy sales playbooks right there, and then push all the data back to Salesforce. So yeah, here in New York. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course.
Yeah, it's great to have you on, and Tommy as well. To dive into things, I first of all just want to set the frame here. We're going to focus on the feedback loop that we think, at least Demand Drive, should really exist in as part of the structure of your SDR team, between SDRs up to management, up to leadership, and back down, or around, I should say, in that circle. So focusing on that feedback loop and understanding that a lot of sales development teams don't really have that, or kind of ad hoc it, make it just anecdotal stories. They might share things like that. Jason, I'd be interested to get your perspective on what you think the problem is here. Is it an issue where SDRs aren't trained well enough? Or do you think it maybe has more to do with the systems in place and how they really just can't live up to what people need out of a good feedback process?
Yeah, the number one thing that we want from SDRs is meeting set. This is the focus, top down. This is where we put all of our attention. And there's a lot of things that we have to do in order to make sure that they can set meetings. They need the right tech, they need to have the right pitch, and they need to have perseverance, probably more than anything else, and professionalism and the right questions. And the list starts going on and on. Meeting set being the number one thing that has to be done. Gathering data and gathering these really powerful industry insights kind of comes in as a secondary, very useful, but secondary concept. Most companies are still just focused on let's first get the meetings going. They're still trying to put the engine into place to do that work. So I think that it's really a case of just having these systems in place so that you can achieve that second order objective. But what we know is that when you have that second order objective happening, you're starting to get amazing data about your market, about your industry, where every call that your rep has is providing you with information. Then we start seeing a lot of interesting things change in companies. The executive team now has all this market data. You can start changing the way that your products are marketed, are even developed. And that becomes very special. But again, I think the reason for this is mostly that, we don't want to burden them with the data collection. We want to get them to focus on meeting set. And that's where I think there's huge opportunity for innovation. If we can do both at the same time, where we're capturing data automatically from every interaction that a rep has, Then we can push that data back to teams, very thoughtful analytics that explain the story. And then that's what we're building here at Upmarket.
Interesting that you use the word burden for how we kind of view this, because I think you're right. Like when you look at the function of the SDR team at booking meetings, you don't want to make them do anything other than book more meetings, and anything that's sort of ancillary to that pulls them away from that primary objective. But I mean, there's definitely a lot, Upmarket included, a lot of technology out there that allows them to get that sort of automatically without really having to think about it or know about it. But there's definitely also like an aspect of training, might not be the right word, but like understanding that as an SDR, you have a secondary objective, right? And I think to your point of like the systems aren't in place to let reps capture that data, but I don't think that necessarily the training or knowledge is in place either to let them know like, hey, this is important. If you come across a competitor or if you get some negative feedback on your messaging, don't just sit on it. Like somehow relay that back up to your manager. You probably have a one-on-one with them at some point during the week that you can let them know about that. That's important data to capture, and just important for reps to like know that that's a thing they should be doing. I don't know if that's like, I have a very narrow, I guess, point of view in terms of like, I've worked at one company and this is something that we really focus on and tout when we build SDR teams, but I don't think it's necessarily the case everywhere. I don't know if you have differing opinions or examples that you'd be able to share around that.
It's a really great point. I mean, when we start looking at the size of the company as well, at a startup where you have maybe one or two reps and you're having a weekly conversation, or maybe even twice a week with the founder or the sales manager, gathering that information and discussing it, totally relevant. You can maybe pass that to the product team very easily. You can create a really thoughtful pipeline of data. When you start going to 10 reps or 20 reps or 40 reps, that information starts getting lost, especially if it's just in a Salesforce note. So
for sure,
the tricky thing is like indexing the data, capturing it, indexing it, making it searchable, making it relevant to the business. That's where it becomes really special. And that's where it's very tough the bigger that you get, because the data pipeline is really not there to collect this information at scale until now.
That's a good point. Like, no, we're fixing it. We're actually actively trying to fix this problem. I'm sure, Tommy, you have a lot of examples, and you can dive into the language processing and conversational intelligence side in terms of like what you were just talking about, Jason, indexing that in a way where it's like, I understand that this is an important objection that keeps getting brought up, or this is an important value proposition that really resonates with our audience. And for SDRs to just have that kind of automatically populate as a note or a whatever it might be in your CRM, it goes back to taking that burden away from them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And the thing that I love, Jason, about this is that, when you allow for this automation and you allow for this interaction between the human and the conversational intelligence, you're actually creating, I think, users that are more strategic and that over time specialize and become experts in various parts of this process. And you start to see the role develop into, I think, its highest form, what every representative wants it to be. So that's fun.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point you make, because the SDR role, and AJ and I have talked about this ad nauseum, but the role touches on so many different parts of business that you can start as an SDR and then become a marketer like me and AJ have. You could start as an SDR and become an AE, become a sales manager. You can go into customer service. So I think that's a really unique way to look at it, is that as the technology evolves, the specialization of the roles around it are going to evolve as well, and just create even more different branches and opportunities for SDRs to move out and up into different roles.
Totally. From the perspective of the SDR feeding into different teams, the information that they gather also can feed back into all these great teams, right? Like the marketing data, they're often the ones that are creating the content that is being turned into eventually the scripts or the documents or assets that the SDR send out. So gathering feedback on that information and then pushing it back to marketing, especially at like a growth stage company where they're still really trying to figure out product market fit, is huge. But then again, at enterprise companies where we've been trying the same pitch over and over, and now it's not resonating anymore because the business environment is changing. Well, if we can send that feedback back as well, it really is powerful for the business when you have, 40, 50 plus people that are constantly dialing and speaking to customers.
Yeah, that's so much data right there that you're just getting a constant loop from. I'd love to dive a little bit into sort of the example you gave about the growth industries, the smaller startups that may not need a specific platform or enablement tool to gather that, but at the same time, they're dealing with a much smaller sample size, right? You don't know if one conversation with a prospect is really going to be a market trend. Do you have any suggestions or ideas about what these smaller teams can be doing to make sure that they at least establish some structure around creating that feedback loop so that as they grow, they can allow that loop to grow with them? Absolutely.
So when I remember when I was working at a healthcare company, probably about eight or 9 years ago, healthcare startup, excellent company here in New York City. And I was a full cycle salesperson. And at the time we were still trying to figure out product market fit. And my tool of choice was Excel. I opened up an Excel file. I was just calling people that were my target role. And when I spoke to them, I just asked them a bunch of questions and tried to fill out that doc as I had every conversation. It got unruly. Maybe 90% of that information didn't actually end up in Salesforce. And I think that that's where the breakdown for me was when we started thinking about, well, how can we figure out this problem for SDRs at companies that are small, large, massive, et cetera. And it was creating a structure for gathering the data. Most teams are not sophisticated enough today to worry about the data capturing structure around secondary information. They care if the meeting was set, they care if you logged the call, how many calls you made in a given weekday, et cetera. So what we come in and do is we provide teams with a very thoughtful way of capturing the data. It's fully integrated into the workflow and pushing it back. Strategically, that's what we thought of because we're engineers and we want to make the best possible user experience. It's easy. But I think there's other ways of doing it. I think that, if you're a smaller company, ad hoc weekly meetings where you truly discuss, capture the information from the conversations of what objections did everyone hit, what questions resonated, or what answers came back that really lit a light bulb for you. And then push that information back thoughtfully, whether it's the product, the executive team, whoever. It's all about that information flow. Again, at larger companies, this is just so much harder to do. And at the end of the day, how can you teach people how to take notes, right? Like you can, hey, here's a good example of a note. Take the note this way. They'll do it twice, and then the next 400 times, it's some mix of the two. So it becomes tricky when we just rely on that textual data, and that's where data mining and what we're starting to focus on is so interesting. And I'm over the moon at the progress that we made there.
It's funny that you mentioned that you approached it from an engineer's mindset, because I did this as an SDR, but I approached it from a marketing mindset. And ultimately my career shifted from being in sales into marketing. But I, as a rep, built out similar to you, Excel sheets and docs and stuff. And I created a system for myself where I would package up this information that I gathered in what I looked at was a well-formatted sort of meaningful report that I delivered to the leadership team on a weekly basis. And then they would take that and turn it into stuff, into marketing collateral or shift up messaging and then give it back to me. And I was like, wow, I'm making an impact. But I thought it was only because it looked good. Because I've seen other people do it where it looks bad and it is just an unformatted Excel sheet or just a Google Doc with a bunch of stuff in it. And they're like, I'm not going to take the time to look at this. I'm trying to run the marketing org at an enterprise level company, and I'm not going to spend time reading a doc from an SDR who thinks that they found something, right? There's that disconnect between the system isn't in place. I don't necessarily believe this is important and it looks bad, so I'm not going to waste my time on it. But I don't know. I think that you can, with the right frame of mind as an individual rep, and obviously you have a lot more experience with this, but if you have the gumption's not the right word, but the wherewithal to really understand what you're capturing and how to deliver it, I think even without a solution in place, you can get it to make real change at a company. It just takes a little bit more effort and kind of push through rather than having something there to capture it all for you. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not like a lost cause if you're at a company where it's not, you don't have a solution in place.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a growth opportunity for an SDR. I mean, kudos to you that you kind of went above and beyond, right? And you were probably also booking your meetings, which is
Yeah. I mean, I was booking meetings because I had this data, right? Like
right.
this is an opportunity for SDRs to learn and grow within the role. If they're capturing this information, you use it. You don't just give it away and then hope that it comes back to you with a fresh new piece of content or some sweet new messaging. Like you can use it too.
Absolutely. I think SDRs are definitely one of the most important roles in a company in terms of feeder from a hiring perspective to whether it's account management or compliance roles or what, some additional sales roles, and eventually that group of people, if you can find out the people that are really thoughtful about the business, they're capturing this information. That's a great way to differentiate yourself, not just by your meeting set, but also by your knowledge of how this business is going to grow and it's going to adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, but it makes sense because you touch so many areas. But I sort of wanted to jump back to counterpoint in favor of what you were saying, AJ. I just wanted to share the story. When I made a feedback loop, I didn't really make it when I was an SDR. What I did is I had my notes written down on paper. And then in the weekly sales meetings, I'd say what happened on the call. And then the marketing person on the call would often be like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe we'll do something with that. Nothing ever happened with it. So I just wanted to share that a little bit as a counterpoint, because I think, AJ, you're right. If it doesn't look good, if you don't share it in the right way, if I was just saying it out loud, like if I didn't send an email with notes that he could look back on, in hindsight, I can understand why the marketing team didn't do anything with what I shared. But at the time, it can be a little frustrating. You can feel unheard. Your job can lose a little bit of its meaning. So if you are an SDR who's noticed a lot of this good information, you feel like you keep sharing it and keep telling people and nobody's listening, it could be another problem. But if you look at yourself and say, is there something I can do to make this translate better to what they're looking for? And there is, definitely do that. It'll help you, like you pointed to, Jason, like level up your skill set and move in an upward direction. But it'll also help that team as a whole really just move and be able to grow.
That's huge. I think, yeah, like the golden standard, right, of a feedback loop is basically like SDRs to managers to leaders to managers to SDRs. You brought it up earlier, Alex, but like if you're almost required as a rep to get that lift from like your level to the manager level, it's hard for managers to meet you halfway, and it's hard for reps to like meet them halfway. You need to have something in place where like that transfer is easy, because if you're just writing it down in a notebook and expecting someone to do something with it, not a whole lot's going to happen. And if you're a manager and you're like, yeah, this guy's just telling me stuff and he's expecting me to like internalize it and then present it back to leadership, like that's also a disconnect there. So I don't know, speaking of like that sort of golden feedback loop and really looking at it as like step by step, those channels, I think the really important aspect here is like how to unlock those channels, right? How to get it to the information to flow easily from SDR to manager to leadership and back. Obviously with technology, that's what you were talking about. That's where it's possible. But I don't know, where do you see instances, Jason and Tommy, where like, I don't know, the information might leak out, or there are opportunities for there to be some type of miscommunication with the way that the information is presented and then brought back to the SDR team? Because like, I'm just thinking of people playing devil's advocate, where it's like, to your point earlier, Alex, what if my SDR is wrong? Like, what if they're giving me information that just doesn't matter and they think it does?
That's a great question. Most of the time, it's a problem of just too much information and not being able to synthesize it down in such a way that we can even pinpoint where to look. Think about the number of accounts that a typical SDR is touching on a given week. It could be in the hundreds easily. And if they're making 40 to 50, 60 calls a day, and they're actually having, 10% connect or 20% connect, and they're taking notes on every one of these calls, there's almost a guarantee high likelihood that the manager is not listening to those recordings and is not looking through every one of those notes. And in the flow of things, it's very possible that the SDR themselves is not seeing the connection between different stuff. They're focused on setting the next meeting. So that's where I think, if we can, I like to use the term indexing. It's just information indexing, where you're really putting information in a formatted, thoughtful way. In an automated fashion, you're not doing anything else with your job, but there's a system in the background that's indexing everything for you and finding the patterns for you. It can change the game. It's probably less likely that you're going to get bad information rather than more incomplete information. Because if we really think about it, at least in the SDR land, every conversation is going from a minute plus, to 45 minutes or 8 minutes, and that would be considered like a good conversation. And in those situations, you're gathering very specific, straightforward data. You're asking a question, you're getting data. You can't really make too many inferences. At least if you're at this point, if you're doing your job and you're asking the right discovery questions, you don't have to infer too much. Just ask the questions and you get the right answer, and then you collect it and you push it. So that practice of constantly collecting the right data and not having to infer too much, that's where you can actually create a very thoughtful, high quality data pipeline, rather than these situations where you come into the meeting and you're like, hey, how are these calls? Well, I talked to him. He's kind of like not answering my questions, kind of pushing me off. I think they have another competitor. Well, did you ask? No, I didn't. Well, I just think so. And it's like, so that's where we can get away from those types of situations if we right out of the gate just have a more structured approach.
I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Is creating that structure is really the first thing you have to make. We've also talked a lot about you said burdening the SDRs with more work, not putting more on their plate that's not activity based. I'd love to dive a little bit into some of those specifics, maybe even what you guys are doing specifically with Upmarket, about how you're able to get that data, index that data without putting more on the plate of the SDR.
That's great. Okay. Yeah. And Tommy can totally jump in, but the first part I'll talk about is the time we're saving when it comes to pushing data back to the CRM and to Salesforce. So we know that a rep, whether it's an SDR or an AE, is spending 8+ hours a week just data entry. What we've done is we've made it much more thoughtful. So with the Zoom extension that's coming out, we basically plugged in Upmarket playbooks directly into the Zoom conversation, so that when you're having a conversation, let's say you're doing a discovery call, when questions are answered, that data is indexed properly and is pushed back into fields within Salesforce. The transcript is pushed back into Salesforce. And we also do a little bit more conversational intelligence to gather some thoughtful, coachable moments, push those into Salesforce as well. And it's all happening 2 clicks after the meeting and you're done. So you don't have to jump back into Salesforce to do this work. That keeps everything much more productive. You can focus on the next meeting. You can keep moving on from there. And I think that the environment for business happening directly where the communication and where the conversation's happening, like that's a real huge opportunity. We want to be enabling the conversation. We want to make it as thoughtful and as structured as possible. And we want to capture the data in the conversation. And we want to mine that data so that we can move the business forward. These are like the optimal things we should all care about. And then on the back end of it, there's all this conversational intelligence stuff which is happening, which provides another layer on top of the structure. And I know Tommy's been working on quite a few different metrics that we're analyzing. I could definitely take.
You want to jump into some of those, Tommy? I think that for our audience, obviously, who's very familiar with conversational intelligence through tools like Gong or Pickle or Sybil, they understand the basics of it, I think. But yeah, I'd be really interested to see, like, what are you actually trying to glean from these conversations, and like, how are you making that, to your point, Jason, are you optimizing the role with this information?
Right. I want to reference something you talked about just before, which is this experience of sort of coming into a company and trying to get your voice heard on specific issues that might be incredibly valuable when you're doing calls or you're doing outreach at such volume. And so one of the interesting things I think that happens just in the business cycle is that you get a lot of sort of your worst problems happening, which are very obvious to anyone sort of joining the organization for a long time. And most of the time, this is because they don't have an adequate solution with which to address the problem, right? And then you'll have to sort of wait for that to go through the organization and get operationalized and get pushed into the metrics before the problem is resolved for the SDR, for instance. And so what I see conversation intelligence allowing us to do is to sort of metricize some of these things in a way that, as Jason pointed out, is coachable, but is also, as AJ and Alex were pointing out, like able to be abstracted to the company level so that the SDR is actually addressing an actionable item with their managers or for the company. So that I see as a major goal for conversation intelligence, which is not just to surface a topic or even a segment of the conversation that might apply to, for instance, competitive intelligence or some type of discovery, but sort of contextualize the conversation for the customer. So I think that at Upmarket, we're very much into creating a pragmatic environment for the user. And so that starts with the playbook, keeping information at their fingertips. And then when we're doing conversational intelligence, keeping an eye on those traditional metrics and those traditional, topic analysis, moment identification, and things like that, but also just pushing it out a little bit so that we're identifying particular, human, sort of human categories for sentences. So I feel that in a way, the SDR will be empowered by having this additional information. And it will eventually make it into, the next generation of best practices for the SDR. So we are cognizant of all of the typical things that you would find in conversational intelligence, but we want to make it a really easy, practical experience where things are at people's fingertips and not just go with, established sales methodology, but really customize it to the company. So that's how I feel we are positioning ourselves to service the SDR better.
It's interesting that you brought up like the next generation of SDRs with that, because I mean, like I started as an SDR about 9 years ago now, and like I didn't have a CRM, I didn't have a power dialer, I didn't have nothing compared to what reps have now. And now we're talking about lessening the burden on the data collection side of things, which, like Jason, you pointed out, is a secondary objective. I think the role is getting significantly more difficult than it was 9 years ago, but at the same time, the amount of resources and technology that we're able to like arm SDRs with is so leaps and bounds beyond what we had a decade ago, what we had 5 or even 3 years ago. It's crazy to think that, like, yeah, pragmatically, I can have a conversation with someone. This information is captured directly through a piece of software, pushed to the company. I can take a look at it, learn from it, iterate and grow as a rep, and then do it all over again, but better. It is a little mind-boggling to think that 9 years ago I was punching physical numbers on a Polycom phone and doing that for the job.
Yeah, 9 years ago, they gave you a phone, they give you a list of people to call, and you're probably, setting just as much, if not more, meetings back then, because it was not as saturated as it is now. It's so much more difficult today. People are getting hundreds of emails. They're getting tons of calls. In actuality, not as many people are calling as much as they should be. Right? Calling is by far, for the customers that we know, at least on the inside sales side, calling is setting 70 to 80% of their meetings.
Oh, wow.
We know that it still works. it's effective. It's hard to create a process around it because it's so much harder to train for, rather than just saying, hey, send this template out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, click a button, you're good.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that's interesting is there's also so many more ways to reach out, LinkedIn being probably a primary one for most people in this space, but it's a lot easier to avoid the phone when you can be like, I still have variety in my activities. I send LinkedIn messages. I friend requested them on Twitter. I sent them like 5 emails, and you can kind of ignore the phone, when in reality, that's a really interesting stat that you pointed out, because the phone is always going to, if you can get someone on the phone, it will always be the best way to connect with someone, having a full conversation versus like a snippet in an email or a little bit of a LinkedIn connection.
Absolutely.
Especially if you have tools to capture that conversational data and then
Yep.
turn it into actionable insights for your organization.
Yep.
I don't know if, like, I'm sure you can get some of the same stuff via like email, text-based. It's going to be different than getting it via the phone, but like a 4-minute phone conversation, to your point, Jason, like you were saying earlier, is so valuable for no matter what the outcome of it is. If it's a yes, if it's a no, if it's a maybe, you have to get something from that conversation. You spent 4 minutes on the phone with somebody. Something actionable is in there. It's a matter of knowing how to capture it and how to relay that to the company versus getting an email back with just a no thanks. Really not a whole lot to glean from that compared to the conversation.
Yeah, one thing that we find so useful is objection handling responses, right? Just having the objection responses available for reps so that they know what to say when a given situation comes up. Having that very clearly displayed so that they know exactly what to choose, and then tracking what objections are we continuously getting hit with, so that we can, as a coaching organization, as the SDR manager or as the sales manager, say, hey, you know what? We keep getting these specific objections. That's what we're getting from this report out of Upmarket. Okay, well, these are the ones that we should first train on when they're coming into onto the team. And this is what they should definitely keep in their back pocket. Also, maybe these are the ones that we should be creating some content and assets around. I can see the marketing head starting to nod.
I was going to say, my gears were turning.
Yeah, like if we're constantly being told that price is a problem, funnily enough, I think one company that did a great job of objection handling was Peloton.
Interesting.
I was, and this is pre-Peloton today, Peloton last year or year before. They were very good at all of the information, all of the things that people say why they couldn't buy a Peloton, especially here in Manhattan space, for example, right? I would start getting hit with Instagram ads, which were, hey, by the way, Peloton only takes this much of a footprint. And they did a little visualization right on the Instagram ad. I was like, oh, this is really thoughtful. The next ad I got hit with was, oh, by the way, Peloton costs 70% less than a gym membership. Here's how you would break it down. Like, oh, that's actually really thoughtful. It took away all of the objections that I had, and that's possible because I think they were doing a really good job of indexing that information. Obviously, they had really stellar sales reps, whether it was on the phone or in the stores, talking to people and capturing that data. And I think we can do a really good job of that as small companies, as medium to large SaaS or enterprise tech companies. The problem really comes down to focusing in on that versus focusing on the primary objective, which is setting the meetings.
Right. Yeah. I think it's crazy that and we've talked about this before, and we've thrown these numbers out before, but 98% of the time you're on the phone as an SDR, you're getting a no, right? And we only focus on the 2% that's a yes. So that's a really big slice of the pie that you're most of the time just leaving as that secondary objective, not even caring about it. But if you can bubble that up to a more important stature, you can be like Peloton and start getting a ton of insight from the conversations that you're having to retarget ads on the marketing side of things, to shore up messaging, to help with customer success. Like you said, the opportunity to spread this out to other departments and just organizationally better every single head of whatever that department is, the better. So I think the possibilities are not endless, but as close as they can be. Well, I had a fantastic time speaking with you, Jason and Tommy, about all of this binary stuff with SDRs. Forget the yes and the no. Let's really dig into the why of all of the conversations that they're having and look past those two simple yet forever traditional outcomes that we're looking at for reps. If people want to learn more or dive deeper into this topic and get in touch with you guys, how can they do that? How can they find you? Where can they find you? How can somebody keep talking about this and learn more?
Tommy and I are both on LinkedIn. So you can find us on LinkedIn, Tommy Jenkins and Jason Tissera. Upmarket's also on LinkedIn, and you can just hit our website up. We're pretty responsive, whether it's through the chat or through email. So feel free to get in touch. We love the subject. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll be rolling out the Zoom integration. Shortly after that, a Microsoft Teams integration for our Playbooks product, which I think is going to be amazing. It's already proven out for SDRs. Now we're moving into account executives as well as founder sellers. So
nice.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for us, and we'd love to keep the conversation going.
Awesome. I'll make sure to include any notes about that, like in the show notes or whatever, so people can find more about you guys and get access to all that stuff. Awesome. Well, this has been another episode of Unsubscribe. Remember to subscribe to Unsubscribe to get less of those nasty emails in your inbox. And until next time. Cut.
Great.
Sweet.
The real question though, Jason, is did you end up buying a Peloton?
That I was just about to ask. There it is.